One man. No government approval. No vote. No committee. Just one private banker who called a meeting, locked the doors, and told the most powerful men in America they were not leaving until they signed a piece of paper. They signed. He saved the entire American economy that night. But here is what nobody tells you about what happened next. That same man spent the rest of his life making absolutely sure no single person would ever have that kind of power again. And the system he built to replace himself is still running your money today. In 1907, the American banking system collapsed. Not slowly, not with warnings, it collapsed in a week. Banks across the country ran out of money. Depositors lined up in the streets. Businesses couldn't make payroll. The New York Stock Exchange lost nearly 50% of its value in less than 2 months, and the United States government had no central bank, no emergency fund, no rescue mechanism of any kind. So one man stepped in. He was 70 years old. He was already the most powerful private banker in the world. And over the course of 3 weeks, he personally organized the bailout of the American financial system using his own money and the money of people he could strong-arm into a room. His name was J.P. Morgan. And here is the part that gets left out of the history books. After he saved the country, he made sure the country could never be saved that way again, because next time he wanted someone else paying the bill. That someone else was the American taxpayer. And the institution he helped design to replace himself is still operating today. This is the story of how a private banking monopoly manufactured a financial crisis, rescued itself from that crisis, and then used the crisis as justification to create the Federal Reserve. The panic began not with bad mortgages or speculative bubbles, though there were plenty of those. It started with a failed attempt by 2 investors to corner the copper market. When that scheme collapsed, the bank that had financed it, the Knickerbocker Trust, faced a run. Depositors wanted their money out. The bank couldn't pay. And because trust companies in New York were all loosely connected through the same overnight lending networks, the panic spread like fire through dry paper. Within days, every institution in the city was under pressure. Morgan convened a series of meetings late at night in his private library on 36th Street. He locked the doors, literally locked the doors, and told the assembled bankers they would not leave until they had agreed to pool their resources. He dictated terms. He decided who would be saved and who would be allowed to fail. At one point, he slid a piece of paper across the table with a number on it, the amount each man needed to contribute, and told them to sign. Most of them did. The crisis passed. Morgan was called a hero. Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent years trying to break up Morgan's various monopolies, quietly allowed one of Morgan's acquisitions to go through during the panic with no antitrust scrutiny. A small thank you. But Morgan was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do this again. And he knew that the next panic, whenever it came, might be beyond even his capacity to contain. So he started thinking about architecture. Not the architecture of buildings, though he funded those too. The architecture of money. In November 1910, a private meeting took place on Jekyll Island, a resort off the coast of Georgia. It was so secretive that the attendees traveled under false names and were instructed not to acknowledge each other in public. The group included Senator Nelson Aldrich, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee, 2 representatives from the Rockefeller banking interests, a senior official from the Treasury, and 2 men directly connected to Morgan's own financial empire. What they produced over 9 days was a blueprint for a central banking system. The plan had to be sold to a skeptical public. Americans in 1910 were deeply suspicious of concentrated financial power. The word bank was practically an insult in certain parts of the country. So the architects of this plan did something clever. They made it look like a government institution. They gave it regional offices in 12 cities so it wouldn't appear to be controlled from New York. They called it the Federal Reserve, which sounds reassuringly official, though it is neither fully federal nor does it hold any actual reserves in the way most people imagine. What it actually is a consortium of private banks operating under a government charter, with the power to create money, set the price of borrowing, and act as a lender of last resort during crises. In other words, it is a permanent, institutionalized version of that room in Morgan's library. Except now the downside risk sits somewhere else. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the architecture encoded a very specific logic into the American financial system. Private banks could take risks. If those risks paid off, the profits were private. If those risks failed catastrophically, the central bank, backed ultimately by the credit of the United States government, backed ultimately by the taxes of ordinary citizens, would step in. This is not an accident, it is a design. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was signed into law. He never saw it operate. But the institution he helped engineer has now been running for a century, and the fundamental logic has never changed. In 2008, when the financial system collapsed again, the Federal Reserve deployed trillions of dollars to stabilize the banks. The banks that had engineered the instruments that caused the collapse were among the primary beneficiaries of the rescue. The architects of the crisis were saved by the institution that had been created a century earlier so that the architects of crises could be saved. The bill was sent to the same address it always is. Here is the uncomfortable question at the end of all of this. J.P. Morgan saved the American economy in 1907 because he had both the power and the incentive to do so. His fortune, his reputation, his entire empire depended on financial stability. When he spent his own money to stop a panic, he was protecting himself. The Federal Reserve, by design, protects those same interests, but it does it with public credit. It socializes the cost. And because it operates largely outside of direct democratic oversight, the people who benefit most from its interventions are rarely the people who fund them. Morgan understood this perfectly. He built a system that works exactly as intended. The question is, who it was intended for.